The wind had been screaming through the empty streets all night, carrying with it a chill that bit deeper than frost. I found the first letter of his name etched into the frozen lake, and for a moment I could hear his voice in the cracking ice. Everyone said he ran away, but the ice did not lie. Mara Whitfield had always believed that a mother could sense her child, even from miles away. Living in the quiet, snow-drenched town of Frostwood, she moves through the world like a shadow, her grief masked behind carefully composed routines. Her son, Eli, vanished without a trace 3 weeks prior, and the police had long given up. The story unfolds in slow, deliberate steps, tracing Mara's journey through frozen streets, whispering woods, and the hidden corners of a town that seems to know more than it says. The wind had that hollow, biting edge this morning. It whispered through the bare trees and rattled the shutters of my old house like it knew I wasn't ready to face the world yet. The streets were empty, dusted in frost, and the snow along the sidewalks crunched beneath my boots in a way that sounded too loud, too close. The sun hadn't fully risen, just a pale smear of light along the horizon, turning the ice in the river to silver. I paused for a moment and watched it, feeling the cold settle into my bones, deeper than the coat on my shoulders. I thought of Eli. Small hands, always sticky with paint or mud. The way he laughed so loud, so easy, that it made the empty rooms of this town feel smaller in comparison. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and let the memories drift, like smoke curling from a candle in the corner of a dark room. The town said he ran away. That he'd chosen to disappear. But I couldn't believe it. Not really. My feet carried me down the familiar path, toward the lake, my eyes scanning the ice, my ears straining against the wind for sounds that might never come. The river bank looked different in the frost, glittering under that early sun. Patches of ice cracked in soft patterns, and the reeds along the edges bent under the weight of frost, trembling. I slowed, then stopped. Something in the shimmer caught my eye, a line, or maybe a letter, half frozen into the ice. My stomach tightened. I knelt slowly, letting the cold bite through my gloves, and traced the pattern with a fingertip. It was jagged, imperfect, but it was deliberate. It looked like a name. My pulse quickened, the silence around me amplifying the sound of my own breath. Could it be Eli? Or had I imagined it, reading hope into the ice because I had to? I crouched there for a long moment. The air smelled like wet stone and winter. A few birds, startled by my movement, took off across the grey sky, their wings cutting through the quiet. I ran my fingers along the letters again, trying to remember the shapes of Eli's handwriting. I could almost see him there, bent over the kitchen table with his pencil, humming, humming, humming. My heart hammered. My throat tightened. The town whispers about runaway children echoed behind my eyes, but the truth I felt was sharper, colder, more urgent. There was something here. Something waiting beneath the surface. I stood up, brushing snow from my coat, and looked at the river stretching wide and still before me. The ice was solid in most places, but somewhere below, under the smooth surface, the water moved. And I could feel it. I don't know how. Just a pull, a quiet insistence, that whatever left this mark wasn't just a trick of the light or frost. I stepped closer, the ground crunching, and felt the vibration through my boots, small, almost imperceptible. My hands shook a little. I wanted to call his name. I wanted to shout it, rip it through the cold morning air. But I didn't. The lake listened, as it always did, and I waited instead. The sky above was growing lighter, the sun spilling soft gold across the ice, turning the frozen letters into shadows I could almost touch. I crouched again, studying the pattern. It wasn't random. Someone had been here. Someone had left this message for me, or maybe for anyone who cared enough to look. The thought made my chest ache, a strange mix of fear and hope. Was Eli near? Was it someone trying to draw me toward him? Or was it a stranger who had no idea what it might do to a mother already unraveling? I traced the last curve of the letters with my gloved finger, feeling the ice cut through to my skin, leaving cold, tingling lines. I stayed there until the sun rose higher, painting the river silver gold and sending shadows from the reeds dancing across the ice. The town's buildings loomed behind me, silent and indifferent. No one had seen me yet, and I wondered if they ever would. My breath steamed in front of my face, and I could feel every heartbeat like a drum in my chest. The name in the ice was a whisper, a promise, a warning. I didn't know which. But I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Finally, I stepped back, letting the cold recede into my boots, letting the quiet press in again. The letters remained, half frozen and jagged, waiting. I turned slowly, scanning the empty streets for signs of life, for someone who might see what I had seen, but there was only frost and silence. The lake shimmered behind me, and in that shimmer, I thought I saw movement, a shadow beneath the ice, small and fleeting, like a heartbeat. My hands were numb now, but I didn't care. Something was waiting, and I would find it. The wind blew again, sharper this time, carrying with it the faintest scent of river water and winter pine. I stood still, listening, letting the frost settle around me. The world was quiet, but the ice had spoken. And somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. The forest felt different that morning. Heavier. The kind of weight that presses into your chest without moving a muscle. Snow muffled my boots, turning each step into a quiet thump, soft but deliberate. The pines stood like frozen sentinels, their needles etched with frost, and the air smelled like wet bark and something colder, older. I could hear nothing but my own breath and the distant scrape of ice against bark. I paused, hands stuffed in my coat pockets, listening. The wind whispered, carrying hints of voices I thought I recognized. A laugh. A word. Maybe it was just the branches rattling. Maybe it was my mind trying to pull him back from wherever he had gone. I took another step, and then another, following faint footprints in the snow. Some were mine, clumsy and uneven. Others were smaller, lighter, unfamiliar, yet somehow deliberate. I traced them with my eyes, letting the trail guide me deeper into the skeletal heart of the forest. The further I went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed hesitant here, brushing against the trees in hesitant sweeps. My fingers brushed against the rough bark, the cold biting through my gloves, leaving lines of tingling numbness. And then I saw it. Something caught on a branch, stiff with frost. My heart stumbled. A small scarf, the one Eli had always carried. Bright, stubborn in its color, refusing to fade even under the snow. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and lifted it gently. The frost crunched under my touch. It smelled faintly of him. Faintly of home. I held it against my chest and walked a few steps further, letting the scarf slip through my fingers, brushing the snow. Questions began to twist in my mind, tangled and sharp. Was he ever really gone? Or had someone wanted me to believe that, leaving traces like breadcrumbs to pull me here? I swallowed, feeling the weight of the forest pressing closer. The trees did not answer. They did not move. They were only there, silent witnesses to whatever had passed this way. I moved carefully, tracing the footprints again, trying to follow the path without disturbing it too much. The snow was fresh, but not untouched. Every now and then, I caught sight of something familiar. A mark on a branch, a patch of flattened snow, and my heart skipped. I whispered his name, softly, as if saying it too loud would shatter the forest's quiet. Eli. The word dissolved into the wind. Nothing answered but the soft groan of the pines swaying in the cold breeze. Time passed differently in the forest. Minutes stretched, folded into hours that I couldn't measure. The light shifted, falling through the sparse canopy in thin, golden beams that barely reached the ground. Shadows flickered, dancing like memories at the edge of my vision. I crouched once to examine a flattened patch of snow, and for a moment I thought I could see him there, small, curled into himself, but it was only imagination. My chest ached, a hollow rhythm, and I pressed my gloves into my eyes for a second, breathing slow and shallow, letting the quiet absorb me. I kept moving, drawn deeper by a mixture of hope and fear. Each step, each breath, each snapping twig underfoot felt sacred. I noticed the patterns in the snow, the faint depressions of footprints that could belong to anyone or no one at all. The forest held secrets I could not name, and yet, in those spaces, I felt him. I could feel Eli, or what he had left behind, like the soft echo of a voice pressed into the air. The scarf, the footprints, the faint, almost familiar whispers, they all carried him closer, and yet further away at the same time. And then the wind shifted. It rattled through the pines, sharp and sudden, carrying a sound that made me freeze. A laugh. Or a memory of one. I couldn't tell. It lingered in the hollows of my chest, pulling something raw to the surface. I stood still, letting the snow fall from branches, letting the wind brush against my face, and waited. I didn't move for several minutes, afraid that a step too far, a breath too loud, would make the trail vanish entirely. Finally, I sank to a nearby log, letting my hands rest on my knees, the scarf still loosely in my grasp. My eyes traced the line of trees, the footprints, the frozen trail that seemed endless. The forest didn't answer, didn't move, but it didn't have to. I could feel the presence of something, him, or someone guiding him, or the memory of him, threading through the quiet like smoke. The shadows were long now, stretching across the snow, turning every branch into a finger pointing at the unknown. I wrapped the scarf tighter around my neck, and the cold seemed to sharpen everything. The footprints, the whispers, the ache in my chest. I whispered again, barely audible, "Eli," and let the wind carry it. There was no answer. Not yet. But I knew I was closer. Closer than I had been when I first stepped into the frostbitten morning. I stood, brushing snow from my coat. The forest remained, silent and patient. And I began walking again, following footprints that were mine, his, or something else entirely, deeper into the pines. The lake was quiet when I arrived, its surface flat and silver under the early afternoon sun. Frost clung to the edges, brittle and sparkling like sugar, and the air smelled of cold water and pine. I crouched low, boots crunching softly on snow, and that's when I saw it, the letters. More than the last time. Jagged, uneven, deliberate, etched deep into the ice. My breath caught. The strokes were familiar, childish in some places, deliberate in others, like a hand trying to imitate a child. I knelt closer, letting my gloved fingers hover above the carvings. A small piece of ice flaked off under the tip of my finger, cold and sharp. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of the shapes. Could it really be him? Could Eli have traced these letters with his tiny hands? Or was someone else leaving these messages, playing at my grief? The thought twisted in my chest. I didn't move for a while, just breathing, listening to the wind skimming across the surface. Finally, I pulled out my phone and photographed each carving, careful not to step too close. The cold bit through my gloves and coat sleeves, but I barely noticed. My eyes traced every line, every curve. Some letters seemed to form words, though incomplete, like a sentence trapped between winter and memory. I bent to take a few more photos and noticed something else, a small crack in the ice, like it had been forced open. Beneath it, the water shimmered, dark and restless. My chest tightened. I wanted to touch it, to reach through, but my hand hovered just above the surface. The walk home was quiet, longer than it should have been. The air had turned softer, warmer in the weak afternoon sun, but my mind replayed every image. Every letter. Every curve. I kept looking at the photographs, feeling a strange mixture of fear and hope twisting inside me. The scarf, the footprints, now the letters, the signs were stacking up. My steps were slow, deliberate, and somewhere along the way I realized I was holding my breath, as if the world might crumble if I exhaled too soon. Night fell before I could even notice, early and heavy. Shadows pooled in the corners of my house, creeping along the walls and floorboards. I spread the photographs across the kitchen table, tapping my fingers against the frozen prints, watching the shapes flicker in the dim lamplight. The ice seemed alive there too, though in a different way, a memory caught between layers of water and cold, echoing through my photographs. My heart ached. Someone, or something, was speaking, and I could not yet hear the words. I found myself pacing the floor, shoes leaving faint marks on the wooden planks. The shadows of the lamp swung gently across the walls, turning the letters into moving, dancing shapes. I sat down, elbows on my knees, staring at them. Could it be Eli, or was it a stranger? The thought of someone else carving these letters made my stomach twist. My mind drifted back to him, to his small laugh, to the way he would press his nose to the window during a storm and trace patterns in the frost. And now, in the quiet of my kitchen, it was as if he had left a message just for me, or for someone who would never understand. I leaned back, letting the photograph slide slightly in my hands, and stared out the window. The lake was gone, swallowed by night and distance, but I could feel it. The cold, the silver ice, the letters waiting, almost trembling under my gaze. My hands shook slightly as I placed them on the table. I didn't know why, but I felt like I could hear him breathing beneath the ice. Or maybe it was just the memory of him. Either way, it was enough to make my chest feel tight and my eyes water. I rose and moved closer to the wall, pressing my palm against it, feeling the faint vibration of the house settling around me. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. I imagined the letters flickering under the moonlight, just as they did in the photographs, just as they had that afternoon on the lake. Whoever was leaving them had chosen carefully. Whoever it was, they knew I would come. And the thought both comforted and terrified me. I sat back down at the table and stared at the images, tracing each line with my eyes. The shapes made no sense yet, but they felt urgent, deliberate. A rhythm. A message just beyond understanding. My lips moved without sound. Why now? The room held its breath with me. The shadows flickered. The ice waited. And I knew, somehow, that I could not rest until I understood. I finally stood, folding my arms around myself and letting the cold seep in through the edges of my coat. I looked out the window again, toward the dark outline of the frozen lake, silver under the faint moonlight. The letters would still be there tomorrow. Waiting. Patient. And I would go back. I would follow the signs, step by step, letter by letter, until I could find him. The night settled around the house like a blanket. The photographs lay scattered across the table, flickering under the lamp. And in that quiet, I felt the weight of it all, the fear, the hope, the longing, pressed between the frost and the shadows, waiting for me to answer. The sun was low when I left the house, slipping behind the skeletal branches of the pines. Shadows stretched long across the snow, thin and fragile, bending with the last light of day. I could feel the chill pressing into my bones, sharp, persistent, like the quiet warning of a presence I couldn't see. A neighbor's words had been stuck in my head all afternoon. I thought I saw someone, wandering near the woods. Just a figure, moving slow. I walked slowly, boots crunching in the frost, listening to the sound vanish behind me. The forest seemed alive with secrets, each branch trembling, each whisper of wind carrying 100 half-remembered stories. My fingers brushed my coat pockets, searching for reassurance. The path ahead was familiar, but my steps felt different, uncertain. Each shadow could be someone else. Or nothing at all. I told myself it was just the late sun, long angles twisting familiar shapes into strangers. But the thought didn't comfort me. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I could feel it, the forest pressing closer, narrowing the path like a corridor of quiet judgment. I crouched slightly to examine the snow. Footprints. My own, clearly. But alongside them, faint impressions I didn't recognize. Small, uneven, sometimes stopping as though the person had frozen mid-step. Other times, they vanished entirely, swallowed by snow that had drifted silently in the wind. My heart began to thump in my chest, each beat a drum of warning. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt heavier here, thicker with the weight of eyes I could not see. The wind stirred again, soft and hesitant, carrying the faintest crackle of movement. Branches creaked. Something shifted just beyond my line of sight. I stopped. Head tilted slightly, straining for sound. Nothing. Just the whisper of snow and ice, just the occasional skitter of some unseen creature. Yet I felt it, the sense of being watched, as if the forest itself had grown conspiratorial. Each step forward made me smaller, quieter, trying not to leave a trace that could betray me to the unknown. I followed the path deeper, tracing my footprints carefully. The unknown prints appeared again, drifting alongside mine like ghosts. I slowed, pressing my palms against my thighs to calm the shiver running through me. Every now and then, I thought I glimpsed a figure between trees, pale, slight, dissolving when I blinked. I wondered if it was real. I wondered if I wanted it to be. The town itself seemed to have shifted overnight, the streets and alleys twisting into a labyrinth of whispers and half-seen faces. I passed a window with curtains drawn tight, catching only a flash of eyes, a shadow. My chest tightened. I whispered his name, Eli, into the still air. The sound disappeared into the branches above. No response. Only the quiet insistence of the forest, like it was holding its breath. My thoughts spun between possibilities. Someone following me. Someone testing how far I would go. Or perhaps it was nothing at all. A trick of memory, grief, and winter light bending against snow. But the uncertainty was worse than any answer. It left me unsteady, teetering between dread and hope. The path curved sharply, and for a moment, I stopped, leaning on the thin trunk of a pine. The wind carried a voice again, just a whisper, just beyond understanding. Familiar. Maybe. Or my own imagination echoing through the cold. I crouched, brushing snow from a branch, trying to find a landmark, a clue, anything tangible. Footprints crisscrossed here, my own tangled with those I couldn't place. The forest had become a mirror of the mind, layered, dark, and uncertain. I pressed on, slower now, alert to every snap of a twig, every flutter of frozen leaves. The shadows were longer, stretching toward me like fingers pointing at some unseen truth. My breath came in shallow, foggy puffs. I felt the weight of eyes that might be real, or might only exist because I wanted them to. I told myself it was just the past, reaching out. That it was memories of him, of all I had lost, pressing through time and snow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, I was not alone. By the time I reached the small clearing, the light had faded almost entirely. My footprints ended abruptly, swallowed by drifting snow. The forest held its silence, and in that stillness, I felt the presence behind me, or perhaps before me, or everywhere. I froze. Heart hammering. I whispered again, softer this time, almost inaudible, "Are you there?" No one answered. Only the wind, sighing through the pines, and the distant crunch of snow under something unseen. I stood for a long moment, letting the cold settle into my bones, letting the unease press against me, heavy and intimate. The town, the forest, the whispers, they all seemed to hold a question I could not yet answer. Finally, I turned back toward the road, moving slowly, deliberately, leaving my footprints to vanish behind me. The shadows seemed to follow, stretching and twisting, watching me go. The question lingered in my chest, heavier than the winter air. Was I being followed, or was this just the past reaching out through snow and silence? I didn't know. But I would return. I had to. The night closed around me, soft and still, carrying the scent of pine and frost. Somewhere in the dark, something waited. And I knew I would see it, or feel it, again. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and vinyl booths. Sunlight slanted through the windows, weak and pale, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the morning air. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. It was quiet, quieter than I expected, though a few patrons nursed mugs and murmured to one another. The heat hit me first, dry, artificial, clinging to my coat. I let the door close behind me slowly, listening. The floor creaked like it remembered every visitor who had ever crossed it. I slid into a booth near the window. My gloves left faint wet marks on the table. Outside, the snow had begun to soften under the pale sun, dripping slowly into tiny puddles along the sidewalks. I traced the condensation on the glass with my fingertip, trying to will some clarity into the morning. Eli had loved mornings like this, quiet, fragile, full of small details that seemed to matter only to him. I wanted to find someone who remembered him, someone who could tell me what I had missed. The waitress approached, a woman with a gentle face but eyes that darted away too quickly. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded, and she left, footsteps soft against the floor. I watched the other patrons. They were polite, nodding briefly when I caught their gaze, but distant, like they had something they weren't supposed to say. A man at the counter stirred his cup slowly, eyes flicking toward me and then away. A couple in the corner whispered, and I thought I saw their hands tighten, like they had been holding a secret. I spoke first to a woman seated alone, silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. "Have you seen my son?" My voice sounded louder than I intended. She looked at me for a long moment, the pause stretching too thin. "Eli. I think I saw him near the old mill a few weeks back," she said finally, voice soft, careful. She hesitated, as if the words themselves could open a door better left closed. I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Her eyes shifted to the window. "I can't be sure. Children wonder. Curiosity, that's all. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. But there was something odd. I remember thinking he seemed careful. Watching, but not noticed. I shouldn't even be telling you. The words hovered between us, fragile and fleeting. I swallowed. A memory pushed itself forward. Eli by the riverbank, eyes wide, tracing lines in the frost. Careful. Watching. And then gone. I left the booth without finishing my coffee. The warmth of the diner faded behind me almost immediately, replaced by the weak sun outside and the slick glare of melting snow. Each step back to the street felt hollow, echoing against the brick buildings. The town seemed smaller, narrower, yet heavier, filled with half-remembered faces and whispers I couldn't quite place. I passed a window and caught my own reflection. Pale, tired, hands gripping the scarf around my neck. The questions I carried felt heavier than the winter air. I thought about the teacher again. Her hesitation. That pause before words. Some part of the town was holding itself back, shielding something. I couldn't know if it was protection, fear, or guilt. My steps slowed, crunching softly in wet snow. Could memories be trusted when so much was left unspoken? The thought twisted in my chest, cold and sharp. I realized that the more I sought answers, the more the town seemed to recede, folding its streets and alleys around secrets I couldn't yet reach. I stopped at the edge of a small square, the sun low now, catching the ice in the puddles along the curb. My breath steamed in shallow clouds. I replayed the conversation over and over, the words, the pauses, the way she'd looked away when she spoke. I could feel Eli's presence in the spaces between sentences, in the hesitation, in the half-finished story. Was he near? Was he watching, waiting for me to notice? Or was it only memory pressing against me, fragile and insistent? I walked slowly back toward the house, letting the snow soak into my boots. The streets felt narrower now, the town more labyrinthine. Every glance, every whispered conversation, seemed charged with meaning I could barely grasp. My hands pressed into my coat pockets. The warmth of the diner, the fleeting comfort of conversation, had vanished. What remained was the quiet ache of not knowing, the uncertainty, the half-truths, the shadows of a story someone else was guarding. By the time I reached the corner near the river, the sun had dropped lower, streaking the sky with pale orange. I paused and watched the water, still dark beneath thin layers of ice. The town's secrets pressed around me like snow against windows. And I realized, the hardest part wasn't the searching. It was deciding to keep going, step by step, question by question, in a place that might never tell me the whole truth. I turned toward home, letting the winter sun catch the wet edges of the street. The wind carried a faint echo of children laughing, faint and fleeting. I pressed my gloves to my face, closing my eyes for just a moment. The warmth of the diner was gone, but the questions remained, sharp and insistent. Someone knew something. I would have to find out. The snow was fresh when I stepped outside, powder soft under my boots. Each step left a deep imprint, a mark I could follow but could not erase. The sky was pale grey, heavy with clouds, and the world smelled of wet pine and ice. I inhaled slowly, letting the cold fill my lungs, steadying myself against the tremor I couldn't shake. Every crunch beneath my feet felt louder than it should, echoing through the quiet woods like a warning. I followed the trail, fresh and deliberate, my eyes scanning for any sign that it was more than just footprints. Some were small, careful, almost tentative. Others were larger, heavier, as if someone had paused mid-step, thinking better of the path ahead. I pressed my hands to my coat pockets, feeling the weight of gloves, scarf, and hope all tangled together. The forest pressed in around me, skeletal branches bending under the snow, brushing against my shoulders as if guiding me forward. The farther I went, the thicker the quiet became. Wind whispered in the pines, low and insistent, carrying the faint scent of water from the frozen lake ahead. My pulse quickened, a dull thrum in my ears that matched the rhythm of my steps. I imagined Eli here, small, cautious, eyes wide in the cold light, moving just ahead, tracing paths only he could see. Or was it only the memory of him pressing me forward, a ghost I could feel but never touch? The question tugged at my chest, sharp and heavy. And then I saw it, a cabin, low and angular, huddled against the lake's edge. The windows were fogged, dark, unwelcoming. Snow had drifted against the door, and the roof sagged under the weight of ice. I paused at the edge of the clearing, letting my breath fog the air. The trail ended at the cabin's threshold, leading right up to the door as if it had been left for me to follow. I felt my chest tighten. The fear and hope I carried intertwined, knotting into a weight I could barely bear. I approached slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soft snow, every step deliberate. The door was cold, ice-laced, and I pressed my hand against it, feeling the chill creep through my gloves. I exhaled, watching the fog in front of me swirl and fade. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and cold metal, a stale warmth that hadn't been disturbed in days. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching toward me with patient curiosity. I stepped inside, the floor creaking softly beneath my weight, echoing like it remembered every visitor that had ever dared enter. The cabin was scattered with belongings, some familiar, some alien. A scarf like Eli's lay over a chair, stiff and frostbitten. A notebook, pages curling and blank in places, rested against a wooden shelf. And yet, there were things I couldn't place: a pair of gloves too large for him, a jacket that smelled faintly of smoke, a mug chipped along the rim. I paused in the center of the room, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on my chest. Was he here, or had he ever been? Or was I only tracing shadows, carved by memory and grief? I moved slowly, almost reverently, brushing my fingers over the edges of the objects. A hand-drawn figure on a notebook page caught my eye, small, careful, imperfect. My throat tightened. My mind raced, balancing the thought of finding him with the fear that the cabin held only absence. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling the illusion of him, a weight heavier than snow and wind, and my eyes traced the cabin's dim corners again. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak and groan a reminder of something that might have been. I sank onto the edge of a rickety chair, letting the silence press in. Outside, the lake was frozen and still, pale grey beneath the sky. I could hear the wind, faint against the walls, and the occasional drip of melting snow from the eaves. My thoughts drifted, circling the question I could not answer. Had he been here, or had I been chasing echoes? I picked up the notebook, flipping through blank pages and scribbles, feeling closer to him and yet no closer than I had been at the edge of the forest. Time passed differently in that room. Each second stretched, the cold seeping into my bones, shadows growing longer as the sun dipped low. I pressed my hands against the table, letting my fingers trace invisible lines, trying to memorize the shapes of his absence. The fear was quiet now, replaced by a heavy, fragile hope, the kind that trembles under the weight of snow and silence. Finally, I stood, brushing the snow from my coat and gloves. I paused at the doorway, looking back once more. The cabin was empty, but alive with memory. The shadows lingered, the objects waited, and I felt the pull again, a quiet insistence that I would return, that the trail was not yet complete. Outside, the lake glimmered under the weak light, frozen and patient. And I stepped into the snow again, following footprints that led forward, toward whatever truth might still be waiting. The lake was quiet at night, quieter than the world had any right to be. Ice stretched smooth and silver beneath the pale moon, cracking softly under each step I took. My boots made gentle thumps, echoing against the frozen surface like a heartbeat. The air smelled of cold water and pine, sharp and clean, carrying the faint metallic tang of frost. I paused, letting the wind swirl around me, listening for the lake to answer, though I didn't know the question yet. I pulled my coat tighter around myself, chest pressed against the collar, and crouched to study the ice. Moonlight caught tiny ridges and fissures, highlighting something I hadn't seen before. The letters. Fully formed this time. A name. Eli. My breath caught in my throat. The strokes were deliberate, certain, familiar, the way he had written in his notebook, small loops and curves that only he could make. My fingers hovered over the surface, trembling, afraid to touch, afraid to believe. I knelt closer, noticing a drawing beside the letters. It was a simple shape, a small figure with arms stretched wide, eyes like dots, exactly like the doodles he'd left in his notebook. My chest tightened. I could feel him here, or the memory of him, pressing against me, soft and urgent, insisting I notice. The ice beneath my fingertips creaked once, a soft sigh that made my pulse hammer. I whispered his name, almost silently, Eli. The sound dissolved into the cold air, swallowed by the wind. The water beneath the ice seemed to murmur, subtle and shifting, a quiet vibration that ran along the frozen surface. I leaned closer, pressing my palm to the ice. It was solid, yet I could feel something beneath, restless, moving. The sound whispered again, soft and insistent, as if urging me closer. My stomach tightened. Fear and longing mingled, twisting into something I couldn't name. Was I hearing reality, or simply the echo of grief pressing against my mind? The lake didn't answer, not with words, but with that soft, hypnotic murmur that made me bend closer, letting my breath fog the ice. I traced the letters with gloved fingertips, careful not to disturb the delicate carvings. Each line was sharp, deliberate, almost pleading. The drawing beside the name made my heart ache, a symbol of him, left for me in a language only I could understand. My mind raced through memories of him. Small hands gripping pencils, laughter echoing through the house, that stubborn curiosity he carried like a coat. And now, here, in the middle of the frozen lake, his presence was undeniable, or at least, undeniable to me. I stepped back, letting my eyes sweep the expanse of ice. Shadows stretched and warped in the moonlight, long fingers that seemed to reach for me. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest splash beneath the ice, subtle enough that I almost questioned it. I knelt again, closer this time, letting my face hover above the carvings. The water beneath whispered once more, urgent and rhythmic, like a voice trapped in another world, pressing against the fragile surface of memory and ice. I shivered, a cold tremor running down my spine, but I did not move away. The line between fear and hope blurred. I could feel it pressing against me, a tension coiled tight in my chest. Was the lake speaking, or was I speaking to it, projecting the missing pieces of my son onto ice and shadow? My gloves left faint smudges along the letters as I traced them again, slow, reverent, almost afraid to let go. Each crack in the ice, each shimmer, felt like a heartbeat, echoing through the cold night. I whispered his name again, quieter this time, almost as a question, "Are you here?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the ice groaned faintly beneath my weight, a soft, living sound, and the wind shifted, carrying with it something I couldn't name. The drawing beside the letters caught the moonlight again, small and perfect, a symbol of him I could almost reach. I pressed my forehead to my gloved hand, closing my eyes against the chill, letting the longing wash over me. I could almost feel his breath, almost hear his small voice, and it both comforted and terrified me. I rose slowly, letting the lake stretch before me, dark and patient. The letters remained, carved into ice that would not last, delicate and urgent, waiting. I could see the reflection of moonlight ripple across the frozen surface, and in it, shadows danced, shadows of him or shadows of memory. My hands were numb now, but I didn't notice. I took a deep breath, letting the cold fill my lungs, feeling the weight of hope and fear balanced on the fragile surface beneath me. Finally, I turned away, stepping carefully toward the shore. Each footfall left a mark, soft and temporary, and I glanced back once more. The lake waited, still whispering beneath the ice, patient and watchful. I felt the pull again, a quiet insistence that I would return, that the carvings, the drawings, the voice beneath the ice, were only the beginning. And I knew, somewhere deep inside, that answers were buried in the cold, beneath shadow and water, waiting for me to reach them. The night closed around the lake like a blanket, thick and infinite. The letters gleamed faintly in the moonlight, the drawing beside them small and insistent, and I stepped into the snow again, heart heavy with longing and fear. The whispers lingered, soft and undulating, promising something I could not yet see. And I would follow them. The cabin smelled of damp wood and smoke when I stepped inside, boots crunching against frost that had gathered along the threshold. My fingers were stiff, and my coat had absorbed the snow like a sponge. I set down my pack and struck a match, the small flame trembling in my hand before it caught the kindling. The fire hissed to life, amber light spilling across the room, chasing shadows from corners that had clung to darkness for days, maybe weeks. The warmth was immediate, biting away the cold that had settled into my bones and, somehow, my mind. I sank onto the rough floor near the hearth, letting the heat seep in. The cabin was still, holding its breath as if it had been waiting for me. My eyes roamed the room, taking in scattered belongings, the notebook pages left behind, the scarf stiff with frost. And then my gaze drifted to the floorboards near the far wall, faint edges catching the firelight. Something shifted beneath them, a shadow that didn't belong. My heart tightened. Kneeling, I pressed a hand against the wood, brushing away dust and splinters. A small seam gave way beneath my fingers, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside, I found folded scraps of paper, edges yellowed, some stiff with cold. I pulled them out carefully, one by one, heart thudding with a mixture of hope and fear. The pages were covered in handwriting, small, deliberate, unmistakably Eli's. Notes, sketches, maps of a world I had never imagined. Tiny figures wandering through landscapes of strange buildings, patterns of ice and water, rivers branching like veins. Some pages had frantic marks, almost indecipherable, as if he had been trying to explain something he didn't yet understand himself. I pressed a hand to my mouth, the weight of it pressing down, pressing me into the floor. Each page I unfolded seemed to carry a pulse of him, a piece of his mind I hadn't touched before. Lines of text described places he had seen only in imagination, or perhaps elsewhere, and drawings of people I didn't know, faces urgent and small, moving through spaces that felt alive. I traced the sketches with my finger, hesitant to disturb them, feeling an ache twist through my chest. The story the town had told me, that he had run away, began to unravel in my hands. The notes whispered another truth, fragile and urgent, a narrative that had been waiting, hidden beneath floorboards and silence. I leaned back against the wall, letting the warmth of the fire settle into me. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional pop of the fire and the soft wind scraping against the windows. I wanted to stay there, to pore over the notes endlessly, to unravel everything he had left behind. But the world outside pressed in, cold and insistent, reminding me that knowledge could be both comfort and burden. I traced one sketch again, a small figure moving toward a jagged shape of ice. I recognized it immediately, the lake. The frozen letters. The whispers beneath. And then, a knock. Sharp. Unexpected. My heart leapt, catching in my throat. I froze, ears straining. Another knock, this time slower, deliberate. Someone at the door. I didn't move for a moment, listening, waiting for a sound that might give me a clue. Footsteps receded, or perhaps I imagined them. I rose carefully, firelight trembling across the walls, and moved toward the door. Fingers pressed to the rough wood, cold and firm beneath my touch. I whispered his name without really thinking, Eli. No answer. Only the wind. Only the distant murmur of the lake, the echo of frozen water beneath ice. The knock had been real, though, that much I knew. My mind raced. A neighbor. Someone else. Or a stranger with knowledge of what had been hidden all along. The notes were no longer just pieces of paper. They were a map, a message, a warning, and suddenly every creak of the cabin felt like it carried meaning. I pulled the papers close, wrapping them against my chest like a fragile shield. My breath came shallow, a rhythm of anticipation and fear, hope and dread. Whoever was at the door might have answers. Or questions I wasn't ready to face. I pressed my back to the wall, letting the firelight dance across the sketches again, tracing the shapes, memorizing the loops of letters, the angles of ice and water. The room felt smaller now, crowded with presence, his presence, or the weight of absence pressing in. Finally, I stepped back from the door, moving to the hearth, letting the firelight bathe the papers. Shadows stretched long, twisting across the floor, over the hidden cavity that had held them all this time. I could hear the wind sighing against the cabin, a soft exhalation that mirrored my own. I realized I could not yet leave the notes, not yet confront whoever stood outside, not yet know the truth in its entirety. But I would return. I would understand. Step by step, sketch by sketch, knock by knock, I would follow it all to the end. The cabin settled around me, warm and alive with shadow. The papers lay in my hands, fragile and urgent, and the firelight made them glow faintly, like small lanterns in a world I could almost touch. Outside, the snow shifted quietly, pressing against the windows, and the knock lingered in my mind, a question unfinished. I pressed the sketches to my chest again, feeling his small hand reach across time, and I knew the search was far from over. The forest was quiet, heavier than I remembered, as if the snow itself had swallowed every sound. My boots pressed into the powdery layer, each step echoing faintly against the trunks of skeletal pines. A thin mist clung to the air, curling around branches and settling in the hollows of the ground. I drew my coat tighter and exhaled slowly, watching my breath coil and vanish like smoke. The notes in my pack weighed against my chest, their fragile paper folded with urgency, carrying directions I didn't fully understand but had to follow. The paths were narrow and winding, almost hidden beneath snowdrifts and fallen branches. Some were old, lined with moss-covered stones, others erased by winter's insistence. I traced each one carefully, boots crunching, fingers brushing against bark as if the trees could steady me. The forest pressed in around me, cold and intimate, and the ache in my chest mirrored the emptiness of the woods. Each step forward felt like moving through memory itself. Hollow, fragile, but necessary. I spotted something first by sound, a faint clatter, the snap of twigs, almost rhythmic. I slowed, straining to listen. There were signs of life here, subtle and fleeting. A small pile of logs, arranged as though someone had prepared a fire. A half-buried blanket, edges stiff with frost, and scraps of food, nibbled and scattered. My chest tightened. Someone had been here, recently. I knelt, brushing snow from the blanket, letting the cold seep into my gloves. A small, deliberate space had been carved from the wilderness, a shelter from the vast silence. I lingered there, fingertips tracing the rough fibers of the fabric, imagining Eli huddled beneath it, small and cautious, eyes wide, listening to the forest breathe. But he wasn't there. Not yet. My mind clung to the possibility anyway, drawing him into the space between trees, pressing memory into reality. The wind carried faint noises, distant, indeterminate, that might have been branches, or might have been someone moving, always just beyond reach. I shivered. My breath fogged in the air. Fear and hope pressed together like a single weight in my chest. The notes guided me deeper, tracing lines I hadn't noticed on previous walks. Twigs scratched my boots. Snow shifted with each careful step. The forest had its own rhythm, its own secrets, and I was intruding quietly, treading where others had perhaps left and never returned. I imagined eyes watching from the shadowed underbrush, a small figure glimpsed only in the corner of my vision. Each footprint I left seemed temporary, fading almost immediately into the soft layer of snow, as if the forest itself wanted to erase my passage. I found another sign, a small cluster of stones arranged like markers, subtle and deliberate, edges frosted over. My fingers traced them, cold and steady, heart hammering quietly. Whoever had been here was careful, moving through the woods without disturbing its fragile surface. I pressed the notes against my chest, reading the scrawled instructions again. Follow where the trees bend, where the water whispers. I glanced toward a frozen creek, thin ice catching the weak sunlight through bare branches. The forest felt alive around me, patient and secretive, carrying the weight of something unseen. I paused in a small clearing. Sunlight filtered faintly through clouds, catching on icicles hanging from branches. There was a hollow quiet, the kind that presses on the chest and makes the heart ache. The blanket, the scraps of food, the stones, all pointed to someone who had passed through, or perhaps remained hidden. I wondered again, was Eli here? Or had the forest claimed its own secret, shaping it in the image of my longing? My fingers pressed into the notes, tracing the lines again, as if I could follow the ink into the woods themselves. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke, or perhaps warmth, impossible to distinguish. I took a cautious step forward, boots crunching softly, scanning shadows that twisted in the low light. Nothing moved, and yet, the sense of presence was palpable. The ache in my chest deepened, equal parts fear and hope. Every step seemed to stretch longer, time slowing, until the forest was a world of quiet signals, half-heard footsteps, and frozen traces of someone else's passage. Finally, I crouched at the edge of another hidden path, letting my hands rest on cold moss-covered rocks. The notes lay beside me, fragile and insistent, carrying whispers of a map that promised something I could not yet see. The forest waited, patient and vast, holding its secrets tight. I breathed in, exhaling into the stillness, and let my mind reach for him, for the possibility, for the truth hidden just out of reach. Whoever, or whatever, had been here, I would follow it. The snow shifted gently as I rose, boots pressing into the pale layer, leaving marks that would soon vanish. The forest seemed to exhale, shadows stretching and contracting across the ground. I paused, letting the quiet sink in, heart heavy but steady. The trail was alive, delicate, and elusive. And I knew that the path I followed was only the beginning. The winter sky above was pale, endless. Trees swayed faintly, branches brushing together, and the forest seemed to hum softly, keeping its secrets. I stepped forward again, boots pressing into the snow, each step a promise, to follow, to search, to uncover whatever waited, just beyond reach. The waterfall was a muted roar beneath the ice, a sound that seemed to come from the belly of the earth itself. I stepped carefully onto the frozen ledge, boots crunching against brittle snow and thin ice. The air was sharp, stinging my cheeks, carrying the faint scent of water and stone. Mist from the cascade hung in the air, delicate droplets catching the weak sunlight, turning the world silver for a heartbeat before vanishing. I drew my coat tighter, heart thrumming, feeling the raw weight of the silence that pressed around me. I crouched at the edge, letting my eyes sweep over the ice. There it was, the final etchings, jagged and deliberate, carved across the frozen surface. Each letter seemed alive, trembling in the shifting light, a message, urgent and pleading. My chest tightened. The strokes were unmistakable, the same careful loops and curves that Eli had drawn in his notebook, on scraps of paper, in the margins of every place he had ever left me a trace. I reached out, gloved fingers hovering, afraid to touch. The roar beneath the ice filled my ears, almost drowning out my own thoughts. I pressed my hand against the frozen surface, feeling its vibration hum up my arm. The words were simple but impossible to ignore. I traced them slowly, reverent and cautious. And then I understood. He hadn't run away. Not in the way the town would tell it. Not at all. He had escaped. The notes, the sketches, the hidden paths, the blankets, all pieces of a desperate plan, a language only I could feel, a plea carved in ice and memory. I pressed my forehead to my hand, closing my eyes against the cold, letting the sound of the waterfall fill the hollow ache in my chest. My mind raced, connecting fragments I had held separately for so long. The hidden campsite, the footprints, the carvings in the lake. Each was a breadcrumb, a pulse, a voice reaching out from the depths of winter. Fear and relief tangled inside me, cold and hot all at once. Could I follow the rest? Could I understand what he had been trying to tell me before the ice held it all too tight? The wind shifted, carrying a spray of mist against my face. I opened my eyes slowly, letting the world come back into focus. Shadows twisted along the frozen ledge, reflecting in the silvered surface of the waterfall. The etchings seemed to shimmer, urgent against the pale frost. I reached for my notebook, pulling it from my pack, and compared the letters, the loops, the subtle angles. It was him, undeniably, unmistakably. My throat tightened. I whispered his name into the cold wind, and it vanished before it reached the roar of water below. I lingered there, hands pressed to ice, listening. The sound beneath the frozen surface was constant, insistent, as if the water itself carried his presence, or perhaps my own memory of it. The final message was more than words. It was a map, a confession, a reach across distance and fear. I realized the enormity of it. The forest, the lake, the cabin, the hidden sketches, all had led here, to the edge of the waterfall, to this trembling, frozen moment where truth pressed against me like a living thing. I knelt, tracing the letters again, memorizing the angles, the spacing, the rhythm of the writing. Each curve of the ice echoed with him, small, careful, insistent. And then the fear returned, sharper this time. If I understood this, truly, would it bring closure, or break me further? Would knowing the truth, the desperate escape, the message, the language only we could feel, finally fill the hollow ache, or leave it wider, echoing forever? My hands shook, gloved fingers pressing lightly, almost afraid to release the ice. Time stretched. The wind shifted, carrying droplets of mist that clung to my lashes. I swallowed, feeling the chill settle into my bones, the roar of the water like a pulse under the frozen world. My mind traced each step, each note, each hidden fragment of his presence. I realized how much I had ignored in my longing to find him, how carefully he had left each sign, how desperately he had hoped I would follow, that I would understand. And now, here, on this frozen edge, I did. I pressed my palm to the ice one last time, closing my eyes, letting the sound of the waterfall fill the hollow spaces. I could feel him, or the echo of him, reaching out through the cold, through distance, through everything that had separated us. The message was clear now: he had escaped danger, or something worse. He had tried to speak to me across frozen rivers and secret paths, and I had finally found the language. Finally, I rose, boots crunching softly against the brittle ice. I glanced once more at the etchings, silver and urgent in the sunlight, and felt the ache settle into a quiet weight, a fragile understanding. The waterfall roared beneath, patient, endless, and the frozen letters glimmered faintly in the shifting light. I stepped back, letting the wind and mist sweep over me, heart pounding, knowing that the next step, the next truth, the next revelation, was just beyond reach. The forest around the waterfall remained still, holding its secrets, and I breathed in the cold air, tasting frost and clarity together. The ice beneath my fingers shimmered one last time, and I let my hands fall to my sides. The message lingered, urgent and pleading, and I stepped carefully back toward the snow-covered path, knowing that the search had reached its most fragile, necessary turning point. The entrance to the caves was almost invisible beneath the frozen riverbank, tucked under a fringe of icicles and snow-laden branches. I knelt at the edge, tracing the pattern of frost with gloved fingers, listening. The wind carried a faint echo, hollow and distant, like the breath of the earth itself. I hesitated, boots crunching softly against packed snow, heart hammering. Every step forward felt like stepping into memory, fragile, delicate, a thread stretched taut between fear and hope. I drew a deep breath, the cold biting my lungs, and lowered myself carefully into the first chamber. Ice walls glimmered faintly, reflecting the pale light from outside, fractured and distorted. The air was sharp, smelling of stone and water and the faint musk of winter stillness. My fingers brushed against the frozen floor as I moved, careful not to make a sound, careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled here long before I arrived. I felt the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest. Deeper in, shadows shifted, the faintest movement at the edge of my vision. And then I saw him. Eli. He was curled beneath an overhang, knees drawn to his chest, eyes wide and unblinking. He looked smaller somehow, thinner, wary, the edges of childhood etched into sharp lines by fear and solitude. My breath caught, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The world narrowed to the sound of my own heartbeat, the faint dripping of meltwater from the ice above. I wanted to reach for him, but words lodged in my throat. He flinched at my movement, and I stopped, letting silence speak between us. The air was sharp, biting at exposed skin, pressing against the fragility of the reunion. I knelt a few feet away, letting my presence be a bridge rather than a demand. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted toward me. Our hands met in the cold, tentative, bridging the distance carved by fear and months apart. His eyes searched mine, wide with questions and recognition, and I pressed a gloved hand to his cheek, feeling the warmth beneath the ice. The truth came out quietly, almost in fragments, as he spoke in a voice soft and raw. Fear, curiosity, the suffocating pressure of a small town, it had driven him to hide, to disappear beneath layers of snow, ice, and stone. He had followed his own map, his own instincts, leaving signs I alone could read. Each step, each sketch, each carved letter had been a language of desperation, and I had finally understood. I listened, tracing the curve of his shoulders with my eyes, absorbing the story that had been written in his absence. We didn't speak much after that. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary. I pulled a small blanket from my pack and draped it over his shoulders, letting him rest while I traced the cave walls with my fingers, memorizing every fracture in the ice, every shadowed corner. The air trembled faintly with the pulse of the frozen river above, and the world beyond this chamber seemed distant, fragile, waiting. The reunion was quiet, fragile, a negotiation between past and present, loss and relief. Finally, I rose, helping him to his feet. The ice groaned softly beneath our weight, a reminder of the fragility of the place and the winter that had kept him hidden. We stepped back toward the entrance together, careful, tentative, letting the frozen walls guide our passage. Snow crunched beneath our boots, the sun breaking weakly through clouds, light scattering across the untouched landscape. I looked at him, small and wary, and felt the ache in my chest ease just slightly. Not healed, not complete, but present, shared, a beginning of trust rebuilt. Outside, the etched ice along the riverbank glimmered faintly, letters and symbols slowly melting, dripping into the water, leaving only the faintest traces of winter's story behind. Eli glanced at them, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. I did not speak. The silence was enough, carrying more than words ever could. We moved slowly through the snow, side by side, letting each step be deliberate, aware of the fragility of the thaw, aware of the questions that would follow, aware of the presence of one another. The forest around us seemed to exhale, branches shaking loose fragments of frost, scattering memories in light and shadow. I pressed my hand against his, feeling warmth seep through gloves, a tether between the months of absence and the fragile presence of now. The thaw had begun, not just in the ice, but in the spaces between us, in the unspoken acknowledgement of everything we had endured. Yet beneath the sunlight, beneath the snow, I knew there would always be questions, traces of winter that lingered in the mind. We walked in silence, letting the soft crunch of snow mark our progress. Every step was careful, deliberate, a meditation on survival and reunion. The world had not changed, but we had, shifted by absence, by longing, by discovery. And as the sunlight glinted off melting ice, I realized that peace was not a conclusion, but a fragile process, built in steps, in quiet, in the trust of being present together, beneath the sky, beneath the thawing winter. The cave, the ice, the hidden trails, they remained behind us, waiting, patient, holding secrets that might one day resurface. I looked at Eli, breathing steadily, face pale in the soft light, and felt a fragile hope bloom. The thaw had begun, and with it, a tentative promise. That even after months of silence and fear, there was the possibility of return, of understanding, of moving forward together, step by careful step.